Have you ever thought it was weird that Joseph totally deceives his brothers two or three times in the Bible, and then all of a sudden changes his mind and invites his whole family to live with him in the land of Egypt? Well, in this episode, we're going to be discussing exactly that. And though it's a story you've heard over and over again, I promise you, there's a lot of strange and weird and really cool stuff going on behind the text. So welcome to another episode of My Strange Bible. Steve Schramm here, my brother Alex. What's up, man?
Hey, Steve. I'm excited for this episode. I'm always excited to dig into a little bit of family deception. It always makes for a good Thanksgiving. It always makes for a good Bible story.
It's always great, right? It's like politics, family deception, lies, and it's good. It's
They're all there.
Yeah. Definitely one of those things where this is exactly why I wanted to do this podcast. I know we're kind of like taking a second for some preliminary here, but this is why I wanted to do this podcast, because this is a story we've all heard it so many times. There's probably people listening right now thinking there's no way that there's like something new to learn here or like whatever, but there is. And just the question of looking at it and saying, oh, it's actually kind of weird how Joseph treated his brothers in this scenario. It's actually a little weird. And just stopping long enough to notice that invites a study of what's actually going on in the text and so much of what's happening. And it's like, there's actually some really cool stuff here. So I'm excited to dive into this.
Yeah, just asking that one question. I was just talking to Steve beforehand. I mean, how many times have we read through this Joseph story? And yet when I went to this to just do some studying up for this episode, just the simple question of, okay, why is Joseph deceiving his brothers? Just brought to light so much stuff in the story. And yeah, it really excited to get into it.
Absolutely. So I think maybe first of all, just to kind of familiarize ourselves, just in case, we should probably talk about what's happening in this story a little bit, right?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay. So the long and short of it is, of course, we all know the story of how Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. Essentially, Joseph dreams some dreams that sort of suggest that he's going to be ruling over his family one day, and his brothers really don't like that. They really don't like that his father treats him so specially. And part of the reason why, or most of the reason why his father treats him so specially is because he is one of two sons from the love of his life, Rachel. We know from earlier in the biblical account that he really doesn't love Leah. He really loves Rachel. He's wanted Rachel from the very beginning. And so in a very real sense, Jacob thinks of Joseph and Benjamin, Joseph's brother, as his real family, right? As his real sons. And of course he accepts his others as well, but like those are the ones that he really has a special place in his heart for. And so we know the story. He gets thrown into that pit, and then they get him out and they sell him to the slave traders going to Egypt instead of killing him. But then they tell his father that they found his coat and it's been destroyed. And so then time passes and Joseph rises the ranks to become basically vice pharaoh, right? Second in command of Egypt.
Yep.
All the while, his brothers are, just going about their business with their family, and Jacob mourning his loss. And then we have the sort of things, the story kicks into high gear when a famine happens in the land and Jacob's family is forced to go to Egypt to buy grain. And then starts a series of events where, as the brothers are coming to the land of Egypt, they find this vice pharaoh there, and Joseph figures out that these are his brothers, but they don't know who he is. And so Joseph sends them on basically a total, like, I almost want to call it a wild goose chase, or here in the South, in America, we call this a snipe hunt, right? Chasing after snipes, which is a bird that doesn't exist, right? It's a snipe hunt. And 3 different visits to Egypt are actually made as a result of this whole conundrum, and Jacob accuses his brothers of deceiving him, of stealing from them, and just all kinds of crazy stuff. So that's kind of where we're at in the story. Did I miss any important details there?
No, I think that just about sums it up. I wish we had time to go into some good snipe stories, because being from the north, I never heard about that until I myself was deceived. deceived with a
Oh,
yes. So if you're from
same
the
here,
South, yeah. I think every
actually.
Northerner needs to be deceived by a Southerner at some point when it comes to that.
Yeah,
And you
deception.
off
It's a win.
off track. But what's funny is that you brought up is how much deception there actually was in the whole family history. Going back to Jacob being deceived with who
Well,
he's
his
going to
name literally
marry.
means supplanter, which is
Right.
deceiver. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then you obviously have the deception of the sons through all these years with their father that Joseph was killed when he wasn't. So deception is kind of in the family tree, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. And not just deception, but also conflict. There's a lot of conflict that ultimately ends up finding its resolution at the end of this story, especially with Judah. So,
Yeah, no, good coverage, Steve. So what is the there's so many different angles that you could take to this on what's kind of your first thought that you had reading through this that kind of came to mind as far as I guess kind of getting to the initial question of did Joseph actually like seriously deceive his brothers or what did he kind of is there some wiggle room to look around that? I don't know. What was kind of your first insight into looking into it?
yeah. Well, I think the first like surface level thing for me was the idea of testing, right? The
Yep.
general idea that there was that Joseph was for some reason testing his brothers, and scholars seem to be really divided on this as to like it's pretty clear that there's tests happening. One resource that I read went deep into the notion of testing throughout the Old Testament, which is great. There's actually a few different angles you could go with there. There seems to be for the sake of differentiating between them, I'm going to call it a divine test theme that runs throughout Scripture. But then there are other tests in Scripture as well. So in the divine test thematic line of thinking, you have Abraham sacrificing Isaac, right? He was tested there. Of course, Abraham passed that test, fortunately. But then there was a bunch of tests before that Abraham had actually sort of failed. Another test that you have is, Moses against Pharaoh. You have a test of Jesus and Satan. Obviously, there's the test in the Garden of Eden, right? All the way back at the beginning, there's the first test, right? Where Eve sins and then Adam follows suit. And of course, all the responsibility falls on him. And then sort of the final test in that story is Jesus on the cross, prevailing over sin, death, hell, and the grave. And so ultimately, Jesus passes the test that everybody else failed, right?
Yep.
And so there's that. But then there's this other sort of layer of testing in general that's very common throughout the Old Testament. Some other very obvious examples are Gideon and the fleece, right? Where he's communing with God and he's not sure but if it's God talking, if he can take him seriously. So he puts out a fleece and says, keep the fleece dry and wet everything around the fleece. And then just for good measure, he says, okay, well, the next day, now do the opposite, right? And so there's that. There's the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, putting Yahweh to the test against the prophets of Baal, and just to prove who the one true God really is, who can actually light the altar on fire. And there's a handful of others as well. There's anytime you see the ephod used, that's kind of like a divining, device, and sometimes there's an actual testing element there as well. So in that sense, I wasn't surprised to see, okay, well, this is sort of another one of those testing motifs going on in the Old Testament where a person or a group of people are being asked to sort of prove themselves as worthy in order to sort of move into the next phase. And of course, in this case, it's tempting to think of this as sort of an isolated incident. But there's actually story here. There's context here. Because if it wasn't for Judah passing the test, which I know we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but if it wasn't for Judah specifically passing the test that Joseph presented to the brothers, his brothers would never have moved to Egypt, and then there would have never been an Exodus. And then, we know that, literally the whole rest of the biblical storyline is about the Exodus, really, in a certain sense. And so think of how much was riding on this series of tests that Joseph put him through. And so the concept of testing in general is really the first surface layer thing that stood out to me that actually has a few layers that it goes down once you start diving into it.
Yeah, the first thing that stood out to me is thinking as well of all the other testing stories that we read through Scripture. Testing is definitely a huge theme in the Bible, which you and I have discussed before. The Bible is all about themes and thematic elements. And one thing, and I don't know if this holds any weight, but just one of the things that I kind of thought about is that it seems that testing in this sense, and all the examples that you discuss, seems appropriate, I guess you could say. I guess you could use that language when in a position of authority and with the right intentions. So I would say a bad example of testing is, I would say, more temptation is when the Satan tested Jesus in the wilderness, and that was kind of a wrong way to obviously test someone, and I would say even tempt someone. But when you have Joseph here, who's not only is he in a position of leadership, and obviously has discernment on how he wants to test them, but the end objective of why he wants to test them, to test his brother's heart, to see their ways, the end goal is not for him to scold them or punish them or get revenge on them, but to literally test them, essentially to find their ways and to discover how they are. So that's kind of my first thought that came to mind when thinking about the whole testing aspect.
Yeah, that's true. And to be clear, there does seem to be some difference of opinion around how that shakes out. Like, there are definitely some who believe that, this was totally benign. I mean, this was not, and I think there's good evidence for this in the text that this was not Joseph trying to get revenge. This was not a act of vengeance at all. What's really interesting is that there is another kind of theme that runs through here, other than testing, is guilt. And what the guilt theme shows, there's various times where the brothers seem to, because basically they don't know that Joseph knows what he knows. Right.
Yeah. Right.
And so there are 2 or 3 times in the text where they admit wrongdoing. For example, when the chalice is discovered in Benjamin's sack and they're taken back, they know that they didn't actually do this. They actually know they're innocent, but yet they ask forgiveness anyway and sort of accept blame. And so many scholars think that they're not accepting blame for the chalice because they didn't take the chalice and they knew they didn't take the chalice. They're not just dealing with it, right? But they are weighed down by the guilt of what actually happened to Joseph. So there's 2 or 3 times in the text where this happens, where their guilt seems to be on full display. And like the first, I think it was the second time when they were being sent back, and they discovered the silver in their sacks that had been returned to them. So basically, Joseph sends them back and says, he keeps Simeon in the jail, sends them back, and he says, go take your family the grain, and then come back and bring your brother Benjamin with you, or bring your other brother with you, your younger brother. And they get on down the road, they discover the silver that they used to buy the grain had been returned in their sacks to them, and they were upset. They were afraid, and they basically said, why has God done this to us? Basically, why did God do this to us? And so there's all these indications in the text that they are actually living with guilt. And so there is a question among scholars and among me, frankly, did Joseph do what he did knowing that he would be able to get some kind of vengeance for it? Was he being vengeful in his attitude and in the way that he was treating them out of spite? Or was he just testing them in a sort of benign way, like you were saying, in order to prove some kind of point, and then God was handling the vengeance on his end? So for me, I actually kind of land somewhere in the middle on this, because here's the thing. It's not as though Joseph was omniscient. Like, we tend to think of these characters in the story as though they know more than they actually do. Now, when Joseph forgave his brothers, he did apparently have the foresight or at least the trust in God to be able to say, look, you didn't sell me into slavery. You didn't send me to Egypt. Basically, God did, but he did it to save people, right? This was all provident. It all worked out. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. Well, that much is true, but it's other than the promises of Abraham, whatever that was, which is, somewhat vague in a sense. I don't know that Joseph would have had the foresight to be testing them for the purpose of like, oh, if this doesn't work out, I like the children of Israel, like our people are not going to survive, are not going to continue. Like I don't really know that he was necessarily thinking that, but it would be a very human thing for maybe not even in a terribly vengeful way, but it would be a very human thing, I think, for him to literally put his brothers to the test with the thinking of like, let's see if they've really changed. Like, let's see how they react when I accuse their younger brother. Like, Let's see what happens when I give the younger brother at the table, when I invite them all to eat. I'm going to give their youngest brother 5 times the portion, which in Egyptian thinking, the number 5 was like a huge thing. And like special honored guests would get more food than other people, right? So I'm going to give the younger brother 5 times the amount of food as the rest of them, and see how they respond and how they react to that, and if their jealousy pops up again. So there's all these little like mini tests even inside of the big test, and I am not going to deny Joseph his humanity here, right? I think there's a very human element to what was going on in his mind of thinking like, yeah, I wonder if they're really worthy of my grace. Or should I, like I have some authority here, so how am I going to handle this? So I think it's somewhere in the middle. I don't think he was being totally vengeful at the same time. I don't think he was like omniscient and like, just kind of playing with his brothers and letting God handle the details in the back end. I think he had some sway and he was using it.
The one really important aspect, like what you said, is, you see that the plan unfold, and as we read it and as how things happen, it makes it seem like Joseph is just a mastermind, knowing that how all these things would come out. Where, in fact, he really didn't. The brothers could have returned home with all the silver, with all the grain, gone home, and lied to their father again and said, yeah, like Simeon, he died here, or whatever, or he left or whatever. And then the whole rest of the chapters would have changed, of course. So this story could have gone a long ways. And so you're absolutely right. There's the human element as well, where Joseph didn't know what was going to happen. And so probably he had a general setup of how he wanted to test things, and then he just kind of played the rest by ear, and as opportunities arose, he took them.
Yeah, so let me say a couple things on that. So first of all, with Simeon, I thought this was so interesting. Jacob really drug his feet before sending his kids back.
Yeah,
like
he did.
Like, part of me thinks that he was going to legit leave Simeon. Like, he really thought that Simeon was a goner. And he only sent them back when they fully ran out of the grain that they had been given. I'm sitting here thinking, like, if I'm Simeon in that jail, I'm thinking, what the heck?
Well, and it doesn't give us a time frame of whether this was, I assume it was more than a couple weeks. Could have been a couple months. I don't know the time frame, but it was more than like a day or two to run out of all the grain, and especially the traveling and everything. So who knows how long Simeon was. So yeah, we have the absolute facts of the situation, but there's just a lot of specific details that are left out.
Yeah. Another, this will kind of conclude my thoughts on like some of the different themes that are in here. But, so one of them, we talked about testing, we talked about guilt. Another one is, compassion, right? So compassion, there's actually a theme that kind of runs through here, and it sort of culminates, of course, in the final act. But one of the things I thought was interesting, Walter Brueggemann commented on this, and I'm going to read this to you. But he commented on this, on the greeting of Benjamin, from Joseph. And so he calls this the welcome of Joseph. So he says, it's God be gracious, which is the Hebrew word Hanan, God be gracious to you, my son. Okay, and this is in Genesis 43:29. Quote, these lines are not taken at random. The father wishes God's mercy, Rahamim. The brother wishes that God would be gracious, Hanan. The two the two lines together frame the movement of Benjamin from one generation to the next. I love this. It's worth noting that the two blessings together, Raham and Hanan, comprise a fundamental formula as Israel speaks of Yahweh and his purposes. And he lists out a bunch of verses, Exodus 34:6, Nehemiah 9:17 and 31, Psalm 86:15, 103:8, 111:4, 112:4, 145:8, Joel 2:13, and Jonah 4:2. Together, these two speeches bestow upon Benjamin the most profound blessing Israel has in its power to give. Together, they anticipate for Benjamin a new history. End quote. And so it's, again, like, you would just never know that, but it's a simple greeting. God be gracious to you, my son, right? You're thinking, oh, okay, well, that's just kind of a nice thing to say. It's not just that. It's all in those verses that you have. There is this, it talks about the gracious and merciful and compassionate God, basically, how he's been merciful and compassionate to Israel. And this is a literal, like, mini instance of that mercy and compassion being shown where the people of Israel are allowed to be extended. So this is God even working in those little details. And apparently with some of these words too, there's a tie-in to the word hesed in Hebrew, which basically means faithful love. It's a special word that is used all throughout the Old Testament to refer to God's covenant love relationship with Israel. It's the only time that word is used, as far as I'm aware, the word hesed. And so it's just kind of cool to see some of these themes working together and subtleties in the story, that it's like, these things are here for a reason. They're intentionally designed. They're in the text, and you wouldn't know to go looking for them if there wasn't something a little strange to point you in that direction.
Something a little strange and someone a little bit smarter than us to point it out to us.
Right? Yeah, 100%.
One thing that just,
Yeah,
sorry, I was just saying, one thing that came to mind, another kind of little rabbit trail, but something that would seem strange, I think, and I don't know the setup here. This is just me kind of thinking about if, I assume Joseph had some type of personal guard, or at least people who were around him, consistently. It doesn't really say who knew of Joseph accusing his brothers of being spies, to kind of kick this thing off. But imagine being someone in Joseph's court or presence, and he accuses these people of bringing spies, and he brings it back. And then the next minute you see him send 11 out of 12 of them back home with a bunch of grain. And maybe silver to boot if they knew about it. I think if you were an onlooker and just someone who kind of was present during all this, you'd be kind of scratching your head wondering what the heck is going on here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so I think there's a clue in the text that Joseph clued in some of his people, at least some of them.
Okay.
And I'll tell you what that is. So the third time when they come back, I want to say it's the third time. Yeah, it is. It's the third time when they come back. So basically, the Joseph tells the steward to put the chalice, right, to put the cup in his in Benjamin's sack, right? And so then the steward goes after them and says, "Hey, we're kind of missing this important divination device here." And it's like, oh, and he cuts open the sacks, and boom, right there it is. And so they literally, like, they tear their clothes, all the brothers are like,
I love that part.
No, and there's actually an interesting sort of quote that I want to read about that here in a minute as well. But yeah, so you have this scenario where they're going back, and so the steward kind of brings them back, and the brothers are freaking out, especially like Judah. Judah is like totally freaking out, and basically the steward says, "Calm down, it's okay." I forget the exact words he used. I kind of want to find that. But he basically says, like, God's got this sort of thing, right? Like, so it's sort of, and honestly, that would have been weird, right? If you're the brothers, like, why would the Egyptian steward be telling you like you're in trouble, but you're not in trouble. Like, it's going to be okay. And I can't remember if that was the second time or the third time. I think it is the third time though, with the cup. I'll have to look that up again. Forgive me for that. But yeah, I think there's some clues in the story that some of his people sort of knew what was going on. But then during the reveal in chapter 45, it says that he actually sends everybody out So all of his attendants and
Yes.
stewards and everybody gets sent out, and Joseph actually does the reveal, contrary to the Prince of Egypt movie, by the way. Anyway, he actually does the reveal only with his brothers, not in front of anybody else. And so I don't know. It's kind of two sides of it. I don't know.
Interesting. So I guess I shouldn't rely on the Prince of Egypt to be an accurate depiction.
You certainly should not. It turns out, yeah, no,
Okay.
good story, good movie, but yeah,
Yes.
obviously some of the details are a little wrong.
a bit cartoonish.
Yeah, a bit cartoonish. Yes. So, let's talk about. So one of the most interesting things about this is the fact that really Joseph played mind games with them the whole time. This whole thing was like a cleverly devised. Like it's almost hard to tell if it was all intentional or if it was really by the seat of his pants, because you kind of have like a story, like a perfect story here, right? The brothers come the first time, right? He imprisons the Simeon, sends them back. They come the second time. Well, and of course the silver is found in their sacks. Like he sends them back with the silver, which is kind of weird. That itself is a mind game. Okay, so let's just even stop there, right? So he sends the brothers back. First of all, he keeps them there for 3 days. He imprisons them for 3 days. His first suggestion is to just send one of them back to bring the other brother. And that doesn't fly. So then they make a deal where he's going to keep Simeon. He sends the others back and says, hey, you better come back with Benjamin next time, right? And so, but he plays a mind game because he's sending them back, but he's got one of them in prison, and then they find the silver in the sack, and God, and they're upset. They're like, why did God do this to us? And he even goes back to the dad. They return back to Egypt, they return back to the land of Canaan with Jacob, and Jacob's like, oh great, so like you got another one of my sons killed. Like,
Poor
what's going on?
Jacob. Yeah.
Right. So all these mind games, but then you kind of have like this story element kind of thing going on, where like you have these 3 different visits. The first visit, where they went in the first place. The second visit, where the silver, where Benjamin is brought back, and then when they're getting ready to leave, you have the third visit because they come back where the cup thing happens, right? And so you have this. It's like grades, right? And like it gets worse every time, and all throughout that, like he's really messing with them. Like so on the first time that they're there, he's really mean to them.
Yeah, he is.
Like he's
the
legit
first time.
mean,
Yep.
right? Like super mean. Pretty clear. But then the second time, oh, it's no big deal, right? And they invite him. They invite the brothers to a banquet.
Yep.
Right? He like literally invites them to a banquet after they return with the gift of like, because they brought back double the silver the next time, right?
Right.
So, and finally the brother, because Jacob relented, right? So like now they're eating with the guy, but he sets them up at the table, lines them up according to their age. And there's themes in the text of divination, which is, if you don't know what that word means, it basically just means like special contact with the gods or whatever, to like magical powers, essentially. Okay, right, is what it's talking about. And so he's totally like, just think about it. He's like totally screwing with their heads. Like, how does he know what order to set us at the table, right? What in the heck is going on, and why, out of all the families that have come to purchase land or come to purchase grain from Egypt, why are we getting this treatment? And why is he being so nice, even though like the silver was in our bags? Like whenever, and that's what I think it was actually the silver in the bags that the steward. So it was on the second trip that the steward interaction was, because I remember now what he said. He basically said, "Don't worry about it. Your God must have given you the silver." Right?
Yes. Yeah.
So anyway, so it's just all this weird stuff.
Well, the fact that too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's really no link. He never absolves them of being spies. Like, it's never brought up again. He accuses them being spies, brings them back, sends them back to go get his brother, and then it's just like never brought up again. Like, how does what does the brother have to do with them being spies anyway? you
Right.
know? So
'cause
just
that's
another mind
that's
game
the
tech.
justification. That's what he uses. So he uses the justification. He's like, no, you guys are spies. And the only way you're going to prove to me that you're not spies is if you go back and get this imaginary brother you're telling me about and you bring him to me to meet, right? So that's part of it, right? That's part of the test. And actually, so as I was reading up on this, it was so fascinating. It's like, actually, this would have been he accused them of spying out the nakedness of the land. And I thought that what that meant, I always thought that was talking about the famine, of like just seeing how bad it is here or like whatever. For some reason, I thought that's what it was talking about. It's not. It's talking about how there would actually be raiders from what the Egyptians referred to as the Asiatic tribes and peoples. There would be these raiders that would come and essentially look for where their fortifications were weakest, so that they could actually get in and steal from the Egyptians and go through their stuff or whatever. And so it was not actually unusual, unheard of, or even like weird, frankly, for a test like this to be put of these people, for them to be accused of what they were being accused of, especially from where they were coming from. Okay. It was actually quite normal in a sense. So he gave that justification for why he was putting them through the test. But of course, all the while, there's another motive too, right? Because Joseph seems, especially when it comes to like him wanting to get Benjamin there, and then also him wanting to eventually get Jacob there and his family, Joseph seems to be forcing the fulfillment of the prophecy of the dream, right? So there's the dream where all the brothers come and bow down, but he's like, wait a minute, something's wrong here. Benjamin's not here. And wait a minute, my dad's not here. What's going on with that? Right. And so the actual, and the prophecy never really comes to its ultimate fulfillment. I mean, it gets close when Benjamin comes and he bows too. But I don't think there's a point in the story where Jacob necessarily comes and like bows to his son. I don't think that necessarily happens, although I could be wrong. But I think it misses that piece of it. So it never fully gets fulfilled, but it mostly does. So.
Yeah. I actually didn't I've forgotten all about his dream and then wanting to see it come to pass. So there's a lot of stuff going on in Joseph's mind. And I would assume, too, seeing his brothers that first time must have hit him hard, where he probably was in a panic, too. So, yes, he kind of had a kind of a calculated plan, but at the same time, he probably was a little bit kind of crazy in his mind, as far as all these thoughts rushing through his mind about the dream that he has had, about what his brothers did to him, about not seeing Benjamin. Who knows what he might have thought about Benjamin, whether they did the same thing to him, or he has no context of the family and what they've been going through since his sold into slavery. So a lot of stuff that the chapters don't address specifically, but are nonetheless still going on in Joseph's mind and the brothers' mind, and then, of course, all the history of it leading up to it.
Yeah. Well, and not to mention the profound, like, for the brothers, like, the profound guilt and everything that we talked about earlier, that they felt the entire...
It's plainly seen.
Oh, yeah. It's real plain. And so, through these mind games that Joseph plays, ultimately, God gets the revenge. And I find it fascinating. Like the text is really clear that Joseph is like basically loses his composure by the time the whole jig is up, right?
Yeah.
And so it almost feels to me like he feels like he has to do this out of some sense of duty or something. And like when it just got too bad, like he finally, regained his composure and was able to tell them and deal with it and all of this. But part of it might have also been Judah. So let's maybe transition and talk about that a little bit. So
before you talk about Judah, I think Joseph too, there might have been some sense of loneliness too, because he eventually can't contain it anymore. And even if he has his stewards around or other people that maybe are in on it, or at least somewhat, that's his family that's there. And even though it's almost like, I guess you could compare them as his enemy in this situation, or because they were at one point, but it's almost like they say you either want to or you don't want to meet your enemy because you end up getting to know them and you end up liking them and you dislike them less. And
Yeah.
so he probably, seeing his brothers and everything, he probably wanted to reach out to them and them to understand him and him to understand them and to come together. And so I think there was through these months leading up to this deception, these mind games, whatever you want to call it, he probably end up feeling a little bit of loneliness throughout that, just feeling by himself apart from his family.
Really good point, because the text doesn't really say that Joseph anticipated this happening, right?
Right.
Like as far as Joseph knows, maybe he was never going to see his family again. Like I'm not sure that the dream. Who knows? Like did he really Because obviously the dream that the dreams he was interpreting for Pharaoh while he was in prison. Those were directly related to the famine that was coming. And he knew that. But would he have made the direct connection between the dreams that he had with his family before they sold him into slavery and his redemption of the people and leading them through the famine? I don't know. And so he may have never thought that he was going to see them again. And then boom, here they show up and bowing before him. And he's going,
and overwhelming, yes. Yeah.
And then it's but wait a minute, where's Benjamin, right? And then I do, you do wonder how much of it, like you were just saying, is him thinking on his feet. Okay, I need something's wrong. I need to find out why Benjamin's not here. And then, I know, I'll accuse them of being these raiders or spies.
Right.
Really
but yeah, you're right. Let's go over to Judah, which we discussed a little bit beforehand. I just never really thought about the Judah kind of story arc before, and it's become, I think, one of my favorite parts of this story. So why don't you go ahead and you can go ahead and take it from your notes there.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to frame this as because I always love whenever you have themes in scripture that there's patterns in scripture, like chiastic patterns, and there's all kinds of other technical terminology for this. But basically, you have a mirror thing going on between Genesis 42 through 45, and then specifically Genesis 37. I mean, you could say Genesis 37 through 39, but specifically Genesis 37. And there's these three things that stand out. So one of them is Judah's reversal. And so you have this weird thing where, so in Genesis 37, Judah is the one who devises the whole plan to sell his brother into slavery. It's actually Reuben he devises the whole plan to put Joseph into the pit and essentially leave him for dead. And it's Reuben who comes in and says, we can't do this. Let's look, there's a caravan of slave traders or whatever. Let's go sell him into let's go sell him to these slaves or to these people. So that
wasn't it the other way around? I thought it was Judah that suggested.
I don't think so. You can.
Okay. No, you're good. Keep going then.
I might be wrong. I might be wrong, but I don't think I am, because there's some people in the story, or some people who suggested that if he had kept Reuben, that's the reason why he didn't keep Reuben instead of Simeon, is because Reuben was the one who suggested that he not be killed, and so maybe they would have got suspicious if he had kept Reuben.
Reuben's the one that suggested they don't kill him, throw him into a pit, and then it was Judah who suggested to sell him.
What's it? Now I'm getting confused. I thought it was Judah who suggested to.
Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites." So Reuben said, "Don't kill him, put him in the pits," and Judah said, "Hey, let's just sell him into slavery."
Okay, I gotcha.
We got that straight now.
Okay, and it was all of their idea, right? To essentially to kill him, to take him out, right? Yeah. They all kind of got together and talked about that. Okay, all right, cool. So regardless, right? So it's Judah who sells him into slavery, right? Or who suggests that piece of it, and then he's ultimately going into Egypt. And so, but still, there was this. I mean, that wasn't exactly great. I mean, yeah, okay, they didn't kill him, but
They
it's not
saved his life, Steve. They saved his life.
yeah, but it's I mean,
Isn't
as
isn't
far as
that
that,
like that's like spending $100 because you save 50% on a sale
did you say
and you
50%
save money.
off? Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's like, I mean, he was basically as good as dead being sold into Egyptian, slavery, right? And so or to the to the Ishmaelites. So anyway, because they were like, obviously the Ishmaelites were like, enemies too of like the Israelites in a sense as well. So it's like, yeah, we'll just sell him to the enemy. That's a really good idea. So anyway, so there's that piece of the story. But then at the end of the story, we see Judah with so much guilt that he is willing to sacrifice himself to save the younger son because he ultimately takes responsibility. So along the way there, at one point, Reuben says, "Hey, I'll take responsibility for Benjamin, and if something goes wrong, you can kill my two sons."
Yeah, right.
He's like,
Yes.
if something goes wrong, my sons will take the blame. No problem, And so there's a lot of commentators who are like, yeah, that's weak, right? That was a weak, that was like a non-offer, right, from Reuben. Whereas, like, part of what finally convinces Jacob is that Judah says, look, like, you can kill me, right? Like, I will take full responsibility. And so at the end of the story, we have Judah saying, look, like, it's the longest, like, single person speech in the book of Genesis. And he pleads with Joseph to take him instead of Benjamin, to let Benjamin and everybody else go. Keep me, I'll be your servant, your slave the rest of your life, whatever whatever you want. But like, my father can't lose his other son. And so in that sacrifice, that's sort of the moment where Joseph goes, "Oh, this is totally turned around. Like they
broke him.
They got it. Yeah, it kind of broke him." So
it's pretty cool that, and even though the brothers obviously kind of knew that they were either being set up or whatever reason, they could have all, Judah included, could have easily said, "Well, it was in Benjamin's sack, so obviously you need to like keep Benjamin." Yeah,
sure.
It would have been such an easier way rather than actually going out and purposely, going to kill Joseph or then selling him to slavery. They could have just easily passively said, well, it was in his sack. What are we going to do about it? That would have been easier, I think. But Judah steps up and kind of, I guess you can just say, kind of becomes a man. And I think the years of guilt too on him, I'm thinking about Joseph, and then probably had flashes of his father, the brothers having to go back and tell their father that they lost Benjamin too. Just a lot of stuff that finally hit him to make him make that decision.
Yeah, and just sort of an interesting motif there too, that Judah was willing to be the sacrifice for for the younger son, and of course Christ is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. It was through Judah that literally like the rest of salvation history played out, and when the ultimate sacrifice in Jesus was on the cross. So to see that sacrificial sort of element there, and for that to be the thing that leads Joseph to take the next steps, and like again the tribe of Israel as the story moves on goes through Ephraim and Manasseh, which were Joseph's sons, and then Benjamin as well. They were like instrumental in the actual people of Israel, right? And once the brothers became tribes, and so really fascinating stuff, like to see how this I almost view this as like a bottleneck event, kind of like how the flood was like a bottleneck event where Noah and his family, like the population is reduced down. You kind of have like this whole story arc reducing down to these couple key characters through which the rest of salvation history is ultimately going to end up playing out. So I thought Judah's reversal in this was like a really cool theme.
It's really cool. Judah's reversal, Joseph, just the whole fact, like what you were saying, where, I mean, all of Israel comes from this family, and we get a special insight into just this particular story of the family. A lot of times we think of a Joseph, We think of Joseph's story at the end of Genesis, and then it continues on. But it's just a really cool family history and family story as well to kick off the whole thing.
Well, look at how much of history almost didn't happen as a result. I mean, like literally, literally the whole rest of the family would have died in a famine, and Joseph would have just been the leader of, he would have been very well revered and respected, and probably died as vice pharaoh, of Egypt at the end of his days. And then God's sovereignty working behind the scenes, this was all part of his plan, and everything happened exactly how it needed to happen, and everybody saw exactly what they needed to see and did exactly what they needed to do for salvation history to play out. So it's just another testament to the sovereignty of God.
Absolutely. Really cool stuff.
So another thing, we won't spend much time on this, but another echo of Genesis 37 here that sort of is a mirror is the fulfillment of dreams. We talked about this already, but the dreams happen in Genesis 37, and then we see the fulfillment of these dreams actually playing out where the brothers are indeed bowing to Joseph, and this whole thing sort of comes to a head. And so you have this weird scenario where like everybody's finally getting to the point where they make amends, but it happens through the scene of the very thing that started the whole thing, which was they hated him because of these dreams and how he got special treatment from his father. And so they sold it, they sold him into slavery. And it's like that very thing that happened, that started the whole thing, happened, and like at the resolution of the whole thing at the very end.
And how grateful they probably were to bend that knee too.
Yeah, thank God, right? That they could how crazy, right? So I thought that was really a cool thing. And then the final echo of Genesis 37, this is the kind of thing that I just think is so cool that people notice this stuff. So just as Joseph was sold into slavery for, I think it was 20 pieces of silver, they come back, to Jacob, and so they've lost a son, but they've got silver, right? Well, in the story, when Joseph's brothers first make the trip back from Egypt to Canaan to Jacob, they come back with silver because the Egyptians didn't take the silver from the grain, right? They put the silver back in. So they come back with silver and a lost son. They're missing a son, Simeon, who has been jailed. And that Jacob even reacts with, and now I've lost another son, basically is what he says. And so you sort of have this mirror theme going on. And these are little things in the text that they're there for a reason, right? It's like this didn't just happen. Like it did happen this way, but like it didn't just happen this way. Like it's the stories are linking together and like wanting you to notice things that are happening to show you how this one side of the coin is a resolution of another side of the coin. Like it's very, very intentional. So the silver in exchange for a lost son is another echo from Genesis 37 that I thought was really cool.
That is really cool. You saying that Jacob losing another son, I just picture him like it could be some type of weird comedy sketch where he just continues to lose sons. And he says, man, another one.
Right. Kind of like Job, right? Like the servants keep running in like, you've lost everything. You've lost everything over here. Now you've lost everything over here.
Over there. Yes.
Yeah.
You lose everything. You lose everything.
Yeah, it's like a reverse Oprah. Wow, I've never thought of Job as a reverse Oprah.
That's what it is. Yes. All right.
That is crazy.
That was funny.
That's crazy. That's crazy. All right. So, are we hitting any of your notes, or are we only going through mine? I feel like we haven't talked about your notes at all.
No, I've been able to insert all of my thoughts and notes that come through. Yeah. So we've been able to nail them all.
All right, cool. So there's a few more things I want to go through then before we wrap this up. Because I plumbed the depths of this thing, and I'm like, this is just so cool. So the guilt aspect is another thing I wanted to touch on. So we touched on it a little bit before, but I did want to make this point. So like, who's the real loser in the story? Is it Joseph or is it his brothers? Right? Because you think it's Joseph. Like when you think of the story of Joseph, like, yeah, he obviously becomes vice pharaoh or whatever, but like you typically think about where he's being sold into slavery and like he goes through all this, he gets thrown in prison, he goes through that test with Potiphar's wife, and it's really bad. And so you think of Joseph as the one who's like suffering in the story. I've never thought of Joseph's brothers as necessarily suffering in the story. Like obviously they went through this testing, but really the guilt aspect of it is interesting because I think the text, like we talked about earlier, clearly shows that they were consumed with guilt. It's like everything that they did to
Yes.
turn around, when they turned around in the story, they thought it was direct punishment from God, not for what they were being accused of, but for what they did to Joseph however many years ago they had done that.
Yeah, it's a very, even though it's funny, obviously the guilt is a theme in it, but it never directly points out that there's no dialogue about the guilt that they felt in their heart. You know, it's like specifically as like a teaching moment. It's almost just there and you kind of have to observe it. But what a great story to show just how guilt can hang with you and hang with you and stick with you and stick with you until you really do get to the point where anything bad that happens to you, you just kind of think, well, I deserve that. Or it just lingers over your head. So yeah, I agree with you. I think guilt is a very strong theme in this story. A very, a warning sign, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. 100%. Yeah, the guilt, like we talked about, the guilt, the compassion. I mean, we're getting a little repetitive, but like all of these things, like that's the thing about this story and a lot of biblical stories is the themes recur over and over. Like we talked a little bit earlier about like the divination stuff and like, you know, he talks about the chalice being used for divination, and Joseph's like, "Didn't you know that I would find out about this because I have these magical powers, right?" You know, and there's a lot of stuff going on there. And then the seating order, like we talked about, and again the mind games with like he like throughout the whole thing, he was very accusatory of the brothers, but like he was always sending them back with silver, or like he was or like giving them or like giving them a meal.
So much food, yeah,
right, and like making sure that they had enough grain the whole time. So it's like, what are you doing to me, Joseph? And it's like that's actually part of everything. I love this quote, kind of going into the end of things here and starting to wrap up. This is a great quote from I think it's Gordon Wenham, and he writes this: next morning, just as they were congratulating themselves being able to leave Egypt safely with Simeon, Benjamin, and food supplies, their world fell in. Benjamin, of all people, was arrested for stealing the silver cup, and they all had to return to Joseph's palace. It was the collapse. I love this line. It was the collapse of a world built on hatred, lies, and deception, and it revealed their true characters. In particular, the hard-hearted Judah, who had proposed the sale of Joseph into slavery and demanded that his daughter-in-law be burnt in Genesis 37, 27, 38, 24, showed himself a changed man. In the longest speech in Genesis, he pleaded eloquently for Benjamin's release, touchingly describing the effects that Benjamin's non-return would have on their aged father, and finally offering to take his brother's place himself. Now at last it was clear that the age-old animosity between the sons of Leah, e.g. Judah, and the sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin, was over. Even though Jacob might regard only Rachel and her sons as his real family, his other sons would have preferred Egyptian slavery to breaking their father's heart. 44, 33 through 34. Man, I just thought that was really good. So well put of how this concludes like a saga, like a world built on hatred, lies, and deception. Even from the earliest times of Jacob and his brother Esau, like their whole world was nothing but deception in their family, like we were saying. And this whole thing comes to a head in this story.
And then the one thing that just was reminded of there is how Jacob probably saw his sons differently, you know, depending on, you know, which mother they came from. And
totally.
And obviously just, I mean, it's, you know, we plainly see in how he treated Joseph, just treated certain sons differently than the others. And so you just you have a really dysfunctional family, like to the core. But you're right, this just kind of has a beautiful ending in the saga here that they all just come together. It's really quite wonderful.
Well, yeah, and there's the question of like, because all throughout the story also he clearly shows favoritism towards Benjamin as well. And in the story you kind of get that like the brothers are over it. Like they like, you know what I mean? Like they would rather have Egyptian slavery than see their father's heart break again, even though how even though they knew how much more they loved, or he loved Joseph and Benjamin because they were Rachel's. It's like they finally just came to terms with that and did the selfless thing and decided that their father's happiness in this regard was meant more than their
Yep,
happiness, and
absolutely.
it was worth it to bring down the whole world of lies and deception. I'll read one more thing and then we can kind of wrap up. This is from a book called Joseph Understanding God's Purpose, and it's written by multiple authors, so I couldn't give an exact author here, but it says, quote, ultimately, the choice, and this is, let me just, before I read this is like the practical, right? This
Yeah.
is the takeaway, right? Ultimately, the choice between vengeance and mercy is a choice between serving ourselves and serving God. Joseph knew that in taking revenge, he would be acting in his own self interest. By showing mercy, Joseph submitted his will to God's interests and the providential unfolding of his plan, living according to God's ultimate purpose. End quote. And so I guess what I would just say to sort of punctuate that is, like, I definitely think there was an element of Joseph working in self interest in the story, but he knew that the ultimate vengeance would not be his to
Yeah.
to give. I mean, the mind games and everything, it's not like he was inspired of God to play mind games on his brothers. I don't think that. I think it was all very carefully crafted. Clearly Joseph was very smart, right? Joseph is given credit in the story for being intelligent, and obviously you don't work your way up to vice pharaoh without being intelligent, right? So he was very smart. He knew he was intentionally designed. He knew that he was throwing his brothers for a whirlwind of emotions and craziness. But ultimately, at the end of the day, that he knew that it was either him get vengeance on this and do his own thing and serve himself, or serve God and let God get ultimate vengeance. And that's ultimately the choice he made. And it's the choice we should make too.
Good final thoughts, Steve. They're very applicable, for sure. I also want to bring to light as well, just we talked about the scene a little bit, but the humor involved when the brothers, they're finally headed home on their last time, and they're going through the sacks and they don't find the chalice, and they finally get to the last one, and their reaction is just to just rip their clothes apart because of they're so close to making it, and then they get, for the last time they have to go back again. I
The
just think
whole
that's
thing
a
is
funny
done.
scene.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It's equal parts humorous and incredibly sad. I mean, you can see the whole
Yeah,
thing
absolutely.
falling down and just being like, they're at that point. They're like, this is it. Like, this is over.
Oh,
This
yeah.
is it's like their worst nightmare happening. There's certainly like a comedic element to it. This is in storytelling, right? This is the what do we call it? The darkest night or something like that. Like, this is the point of no return. Like, when all hope is lost at the end, like near the end of the story, before Joseph, reveals his hand, and then everything ends up turning out well. But at that point, they're thinking, we're done. Like, this is bad. We're done for.
Yeah.
So
All right,
really
Steve. Well,
wild.
another episode in the books. This was a great story to cover.
Oh, yeah.
I think we kind of aimed to set out initially on some of these episodes to focus on a couple verses here and there, but we kind of took this whole story, and I'm actually surprised we were able to contain it within an hour, or about an hour.
Yeah.
But a lot of good stuff with this story. I'm glad we decided to. It just shed some light on some things that I just took for granted reading through it over and over and over, and never really appreciating the nuances of it.
Oh yeah. I mean, I'll never read the story the same way again. And
Absolutely.
that's what I love about this. I really I really hope that people who listen to this podcast come away with the same thought. Like, oh man, I'll just never read that story again.
100%.
And that's why I think sometimes we need to cover things that are like not as obviously weird. Like, this isn't an obviously weird story because we're so used to it, but like, it is weird and it is strange, and it's also part of what makes the Bible so stinking awesome. So,
100%.
hey, we need to find a comment of the week. Did you have one? I thought you had found one earlier that might have been a good.
There's a few. Let me see. There's a few doozies out there. I really like this one. I mean, are we looking for humor or a legit
anything?
one?
And just a comment of the week. It
I
can
like
be nice,
the one
legit.
I like the one, the political pit bull. What a great name too. He commented on the, did God create aliens? He said, we are created in his image, so no aliens. Also, God created no other places for the supposed aliens to live. Space is fake, and so are planets. Those little dots are angels. Read the book of Jude. The planets will be punished for changing their course. Earth is flat.
So there's that.
That's a good one.
That's a good one. Pitbull Man knows his stuff.
Pitbull,
really.
he does.
I think we could just stop the podcast right now, and that would be good.
That would be good. Let me see if there's any other that come to mind. Oh yeah, here's this guy. It would almost be, I hate to make fun of this guy, but it'd almost be worth just reading all 3 comments. He said, if you need proof, I can deep dive as far as your intellect and devotion can stand, or I can keep it on the shallow end and hit you with verse after verse, demonstrating the merest of consistency. And then he goes on and on. And then later he says, okay, after listening to you guys for a few, I won't need to reduce the number by 2, and likely I can engage you on the higher levels without having to define everything as I go. Cool.
Yeah. Hey, you know what? I'll take that as a compliment. I thank you.
I do too. Yeah.
Yes, this is great. Yeah, you know.
We actually had a cocky guy admit that he could probably converse with us on his intellectual level.
This is great. Yeah, 100%.
So,
yep. I'm so thrilled. I'm
all
so
of those
thrilled
are,
that people don't think we're total dingbats. So.
Right. All of those are great, though.
Well, there are some who think we're total dingbats, and I think we'll share some of those comments at some point.
I also do like this guy who commented on why was the Bible written so long ago, and he said they're defining the word context. That's a great one, too.
Yeah.
This one person said, I can dig it, subscribe.
Yeah. Yeah.
So some really good ones there. So there's a few good ones.
Absolutely. No, I love that. Love the engagement. Keep commenting. Who knows? Your comment might just make it on a comment of the week.
Comment of the week.
Yeah. Boom. All right. Well, that's about all for this one. Thank you all so much for hanging out with us. If you find this podcast interesting, please share it with your friends. Tell everyone you know. We'd love to have more listeners and viewers. And we think that the Lord's really going to use this. And we're excited about the response so far.
Awesome. Yep. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.